Yo, what is up, guys? Will here from Fantasy Flock Basketball with Canyon, and we are going to be going through our top 12 updated top 12 rankings for the rest of the season for NBA Fantasy. We're going to be looking at it from a points format perspective, but we'll talk about the category implications for a lot of these players. You don't want to overreact to the first, beginning of the season, right? We've only had 5 to 7, 8 for some of these guys games played. So you don't want to overreact to these first starts, but I think we've seen enough where I feel confident updating a lot of these guys. And if I was going into a draft today, this is probably what my first round I would expect to look like if I was drafting from each of these spots. So to start it off, number one, we have the number one in fantasy points per game player and the number one in usage percentage. It's Luka Doncic. This is an update. We didn't have Luka first overall heading into the draft, but man, he's been insane. And it's one of those things where, man, when Luka plays, it's hard to argue that any player is going to be able to match what he's doing from a fantasy points per game perspective, right? The scoring has been insane. He's, matching MJ records right now. Obviously, the rebounding and assist numbers are really, really strong. And the defensive stats have been a little bit up. Now, those are some things that maybe you don't expect to maintain throughout the entire season. But even without those, man, he has been really strong. He's leading in fantasy points per game by 4 points, which is pretty significant on a per game basis. And it's Luka's team and it's Luka Magic. And honestly, I think the top three, I still feel pretty strong, are the top three. Spoiler, we've got Giannis and Jokic in that top three as well. I still think that maintains, but for me, Luka is at the top of that list.
Yeah, I mean, Brunson leaving there definitely helps, right? He's going to grab all that usage and has already being number one in usage, and the points are there to show for it. Points should probably come down a little bit, but everything else looks like it could maintain. So yeah, he's having an MVP-like season already. Number two here, we've got Giannis, probably to no surprise. I think he was number two to start the season as well. 60 points. Fantasy points per game, 4 under Luka, but also 5 higher than the next person here. So just a great start out of the gate for Giannis, right? Points and rebounds so far have been incredible. No Middleton helps, but the assists were what we kind of wanted to expect as well, being around 5 per game. Defensively, he's incredible. Giannis is probably the one guy in this list that's kind of just showed up and done what we thought he would do. Not gonna rise over Luka, but not gonna fall to anywhere else. He's just come out of the gate, put up 34 points a game, 13 rebounds a game, 5 assists, defensive stats. He's just doing what he does best. And I think, no Middleton helps a little bit, but even with Middleton back, I think maybe the points take a little bit of a hit. I think the rebounds will still be there. Assists might have some more upside, and the defense is also gonna still be there. So I think Giannis is very, very firmly a number 2 guy here for us.
Definitely. And, I talked about the top three. Next up here, we do have Jokic still in the top three. He's 9th in fantasy points per game. He's 64th in usage, which is just crazy, crazy low percentage. Now, when I talk about usage percentage, I do want to preface it. It's a pretty funky stat. It's not perfect in determining actual player usage. It's more based on field goal attempts, free throw attempts, and turnovers than it is on other peripherals like assists. It really has to do with who's ending possessions. So, you talk about the field goal percents, free throw attempts, and the turnovers. And obviously Jokic has not been shooting a ton. That's kind of been the thing this season as well. He's had some pretty low scoring dud games, but I still expect this season, even with MPJ and Jamal Murray coming back, I still think he'll be close to what he was in 2020, where he was still, a 26 points per game guy. He's around 20-ish right now, which I think he'll be able to improve on that. And the peripherals are still there and very, very strong. So I still think Jokic, even at 9th in fantasy points per game on the season, I still feel confident having him in my top three. But I think you have to give the edge to Luka and Giannis with what we've seen from them this far.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people are kind of getting a little concerned with Jokic so far, but like you said, we've seen him with Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray have an MVP-like season, so I think he'll be just fine, and just his high floor, he's going to stay there at number 3. Number 4 here, it's an interesting one. It's James Harden. Higher on Harden than most people. He's showing kind of older Harden, back up to like 16 shots per game already out of the gate. Some games without Embiid already, but just such a high floor, 22.7 boards, 10 assists so far with a steal in there as well. I have him at 4 just because I think he's got one of the highest floors and most consistency out of anybody here, right? This is a guy that if he's on your roster, you can play him during the week, and you can expect a near triple-double every game. He's going to play more games than Embiid. He's going to be more consistent, and he's going to fill the stat sheet a bit more as well. He's going to get you close to double-double in rebounds, double-double in assists. He's going to be flirting with triple-doubles, and I think he can be more aggressive like he has already been on the scoring side. So the more scoring upside, he's getting closer kind of to older Harden, and I think he's just one of the safest and most consistent guys here, which is kind of why I give him the nod at 4. I know some of you might disagree with this, but it really is just a big nod to his consistency and his high floor, and even the high ceiling that we haven't really even talked about, that he could unleash and do in games without Embiid, that Embiid may miss. So Harden averaging, that 22, 7, and 10. I think I like him slot here at number 4, even though a 37 in usage percentage, and he's still putting up these kind of numbers. He's just Mr. Consistent for me right out of the gate. He's doing it well alongside Maxey and Embiid or without Embiid. So Harden is there at 4.
Yeah, and I know, like we'd mentioned, I know might be a little bit of a surprise. I do think it's a pretty significant tier break from the top 3 to kind of 4 through 12. So I do kind of want to mention that it is difficult kind of making the rankings out perfectly from here on out. But I do think Harden, even with some dud scoring games like we saw in that Raptors game as well, I mean, he's still 12th in fantasy points per game, even with that. And the difference between the 12th and the 5th ranked player in fantasy points per game is only two points. So, not a super significant jump between those. So I think it's pretty close with some pretty significantly high scoring games, from a fantasy perspective for a lot of those guys in that top 12. Next up here, Harden's old teammate, we've got KD here, who has just been pretty insane to start from a scoring perspective. Obviously, has been pretty nuts. I know the peripherals, at least to start the season, weren't as great, and I think that had to do a little bit with the way the Nets are playing offensively, and obviously Ben Simmons playing a little bit more of that point guard facilitating role. But I just expect KD to be so consistent from a scoring perspective that he is just going to be weekly, night in and night out, a guy who's going to be a top 10 guy. So I think it's really hard to look at what he's been doing from a scoring perspective. And even with the Nets struggles altogether, he still feels like he's going to be flirting with 30 points a night. So I think he's one of those guys where from a consistency perspective, what we've seen from him in his career and also to start the season, he's a guy that I think who already was a top 7, top 8 pick in drafts. I think he deserves to be in the top 5, top 6.
Yeah, and I think being alongside Kyrie and Ben Simmons, that might hurt his peripherals a little bit. Like rebounding assists might not be as high as we want. But like you said, he's been super elite scoring-wise, which isn't really a big surprise. But also, he's probably the one guy that will play most likely the most games. Kyrie has sat out his fair share. Also, obviously, Ben Simmons already is sitting out. So he could benefit from, some usage there in games that those guys are out. Next up here at 6, we've got Joel Embiid. He had a couple 5 rebound games early this season, which really hurt his averages, and already missed a couple games. Only played 6, I believe, of their 8 so far of this recording. But he's averaging 27, 9.5, 3 assists, and almost a block and a half per game. So maybe a slower start, why he's down here at 6. But still, he's going to be one of the most elite centers, positionally. He's definitely a value to have, and everything that we've seen already, it's been a good backbone for success moving forward, right? I think his points can go up even more to like 28, 29, closer to last season. And then again, those rebounds, those 2 bad rebounding games, they had some tough matchups against the Raptors, like we were talking about with Harden. Those 2 rebounding games really bring his averages down. I think he can definitely be back to like a 28 and 12 guy with the defensive upside. So the injuries might hold him back a little bit more than it did last season, but I still like Embiid to play, over 60 games, much more than like an Anthony Davis this season. So yeah, an elite center with high defensive upside. Of course, we know what Embiid can do. MVP finalist last season, so Embiid here is at 6.
Definitely, yeah. Still like Embiid rest of the season. I know it feels like he's dropped pretty significantly from being a guy who was, you expect to be the 4th guy, but I still value him pretty close there. So we're not down on Embiid or anything. And I think he'll be a lot better than the 16th player in fantasy points per game that we've seen up until this point. Next up here, we've got SGA, who probably one of the biggest risers. I think there's 2 guys in here you could call just massive risers who probably wasn't considered a first round pick, especially with the injury questions heading into the season. That was a big thing. But man, you just look at this team and what Shea's doing right now. And I know you probably don't expect the scoring to be able to maintain or even the defensive stats. That's been a big thing for his production as well. But he's just been so good, and it hasn't really been insane efficiency scoring, right? It's just a really high volume. The offense runs through Shea. He's playing amazing. And that's the biggest thing, right? When you look at a lot of these guys who have really strong production to start the season, you want to look, are they shooting a crazily efficient from 3 or from 2 or just anywhere across the floor, something we don't expect them to maintain. And Shea's not really doing that. It's not like he's shooting crazy high efficient from 3. It's right around where he's at, even a little bit lower. And he's shooting pretty close to what he shot, around 50%. Obviously, that's on the higher end of what you expect from him, but it's not insane. So I think it's one of those things where Shea is just playing at a level that I don't think he necessarily will maintain the entire season, but he's 3rd in fantasy points per game right now. So even if he drops off a little bit and he's not keeping up the scoring to that point, I think you look at this team and it's hard to argue that Shea's not going to be pretty close to what he's been doing to start the season.
Yeah, they've had a lot of injuries too across the board that may have helped him as well. But I mean, even with everybody healthy, he's the guy there, right? So, like you said, if there's a little bit of a give on those crazy defensive stats or even points category stats, I think he can still be like a top 12 guy at the end of the season for sure. Next up here, right under him, we've got Ja. I don't think anybody should be surprised too much at the start from Ja. 33 points per game, 4.5 rebounds and about 6 assists. He's just doing, what we kind of expected. He's electric. He can score at will, and his 3-point shooting has looked really nice early. The assists are looking promising as well. He had an end of the season last season on a good rebounding rate and maybe less of an assist rate, but alongside if Desmond Bane can stay healthy for him. And once he gets those other pieces back, like Jaren Jackson as well, the assist numbers can continue to climb or stay like at a high floor of 6 there. So I like the points to honestly stay around 30. He's just that good, and the assist numbers are great. And so it's kind of a classic what we expected from Ja. And the fact that he's down here at 8 is less of a not a diss on Ja. It's just kind of more of a nod to the higher scoring that we've seen in the NBA so far and the other guys ahead of him. So Ja is here firmly at 8.
Yeah, and I love Ja a lot. I think Ja and SGA are really close for me. Kind of give the nod to Shea there just slightly, but I mean they're neck and neck the way that both of them are playing right now. And next up here, this is probably the second biggest riser. We've got Pascal Siakam, and he has just been insane to start the season. He's 6th in fantasy points per game right now. Crazy start. I mean, he had pretty much career highs across the board last season. Just barely missed out on a career high in points, but he was right there with his career high. And then his peripherals, his rebounds and assists were the highest, and they've been even better to start the season. And I don't necessarily, it's one of those where you don't really expect it to necessarily maintain exactly what he's doing right now. But man, this Raptors team, the way he's playing offensively, I mean, he's just going to play big minutes. That's just kind of a Raptors thing. It's just hard to look at what Siakam's doing. And even if it doesn't maintain exactly where he's at right now, he's just been insane. And I expect him to be able to put up close to what he's doing, which is really strong.
Siakam's just been unreal, looking to have like an MVP type season from him. The facilitating is insane. I actually do think that he can keep this up with just the roster that he has around him really helps as well. So next up here at 10, we've got Jason Tatum, kind of a top 8 guy, I believe, in the preseason, but he's averaging 31, 7, and 3.5 assists right now. Assists are a little lower than we might have liked here, but the Celtics have played some pretty good defensive teams so far. They played Miami, the 76ers, the Cavs, and so I'm not too worried about, I wouldn't even call it a slow start, right? He's averaging 31 points per game. His 3-point percentage has picked up a lot over the last 4 games. I think he's shooting around 50% from 3, which is a big thing that we wanted to see heading into this next season. And I think Tatum can consistently be a 30-point guy. I think he can average close to 30 points per game this season. The rebounding will be there. And then we just want to see a little bit of an assist bump to kind of get him closer to the top 5 in this list. But I think that'll come with better matchups and more time with the team. But Tatum here, another guy that's pretty consistent, right? I think he's going to get a lot of usage, obviously, a lot of shots up. He should be around 30 points per game, good rebounding ceiling. And then defensively, he's a great defender too. So close to a steal and a block per game, which is also very nice. At 13 total in the points per game for fantasy, but here at 10 for us, I think Tatum's another high floor guy for us here at 10.
Definitely. And the next up here at the 11th spot, we've got LeBron James, who's 10th in fantasy points per game right now, 14th in usage rate. And it's kind of what we expected, at least on his numbers overall to start the season. We expected, the assist numbers to come up a little bit and then the scoring to drop, obviously without playing significant games with Anthony Davis. But even with Anthony Davis, he's been pretty strong, and AD really only missing 1 game and pretty much playing the rest of them. He's been a top 10 points per game guy. And I think LeBron's one of those guys who has upside with AD out, obviously with what we saw last season. And I still expect him to be a top 12-ish guy from a fantasy points per game standpoint for the rest of the season. He's going to miss a couple games here and there, but that's kind of what you expect from a lot of these guys in the top 12, right? We've already touched on Embiid. So I think just from a production standpoint, LeBron's having a strong enough season. Man, I feel like he's going to do this until he's 40. But yeah, he's just one of those guys where from a fantasy points per game standpoint, you feel pretty safe night in and night out. So there's a lot of guys who are going to miss out on the top 12 that maybe you could argue are having better seasons than LeBron. But I think from a floor standpoint, he feels really safe night in and night out.
Yeah, the nice thing with him is we've seen him do this with so many different lineups for LA, right? So if their struggles continue and they, have injuries or move things around in the future, you still got to feel good about LeBron here. Last up here at 12, unfortunately, only room for one more person in this top 12. We're giving it to Curry. Curry's had an insane start to the season so far. Super, super high rebounding efficiency. 30 points per game, 7.5 rebounds a game, 6.5 assists a game, and almost a steal and a half a game as well. So obviously we know Curry can light it up in the scoring region. 30 a game isn't too much of a shock, but it's going to be kind of hard to maintain this rate, I think. Specifically with the rebounding, it's very, very high. He's been a decent rebounder for his kind of size and his position in the past, but I think that is going to, regress to the mean a little bit. Same with the points. Points could come down a little bit if we see Clay more consistent and more healthy as well. We've already had Clay in and out of games, and Poole on the edge there off the bench coming in. He can kind of eat into that usage as well sometimes. But I think Curry's start, you have to put him here at 12. He's greatest shooter in the world. He could be up there at 30 for the season. I think that will come down a little bit, and so will his rebounds, but I think he's still going to be like a 27, 28 points per game guy and flirt with maybe 6 boards, 6 assists or 7 assists with some defensive stats. So Curry just gets in here at the 12 spot for us.
Yeah, definitely. And the volume too with Curry, right? He's one of those guys who can kind of have these mirage stretches, right? Where he shoots crazy efficient from 3, but he hasn't really done that, right? He's been right at, his career average, or even a little bit lower than that, at least to this point in the season. So obviously the rebounding is one of those you expect to come down a little bit, but yeah, like Kenny had mentioned, expect him to be able to maintain close to the scoring that we're seeing from him. So like him here. I will say we've got a couple of honorable mentions that need to be brought up. Like these are guys where I would not argue with you if you had them within your top 12 or even, knocked Curry out and kind of had these guys at 12. First guy I want to mention is Donovan Mitchell, who's been insane to start the season. He's 5th in fantasy points per game, but obviously you have to preface Darius Garland has missed significant time with the eye injury. He's expecting to be back soon. I think he's questionable for the game tonight, so you expect him to play soon and not have any limitations. So that will probably obviously impact his offensive usage. And then Trae Young's one of those guys. He's 15th in fantasy points per game. He's a top 5 usage guy, so I expect him to flirt right around with where the top 12 guys are going to be at from a fantasy points per game standpoint, but I think I just have to give the nod to what these other guys are doing right now. And then the last honorable mention is Anthony Davis. He's 7th in fantasy points per game, but like we had mentioned, he's just never going to be a first round guy with the injuries. On a production standpoint, on a fantasy points per game standpoint, yes, for sure. But with the injuries, question marks, for a guy who's dealing with the injuries right now, you just can't feel confident having him as a top 12 guy. So he's one who I want to bring up from a production standpoint, but he just would never be, in the first round, unfortunately. So that does it for the honorable mentions and our top 12. Let us know what we got wrong. I'm sure everyone's got their different top 12s. A lot of this is a little reactionary, but it's reactionary to what we're seeing from production. So it'll be fun to see what this looks like, midway through the season and how much has changed through that. Because obviously we've only seen, 6 to 8 games for most of these guys. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.